It was a Sunday morning, June 1st, 1862. Elijah Coker woke up, got out of bed, and intended to spend the morning down by the creek on his property, accompanied by his wife Nancy and their 2 young children. Suddenly, shots rang out, the bullets ripping into the home. A band of armed men had appeared outside, seemingly out of nowhere. Nancy screamed for her husband to run. As he tried to escape out of the home on foot, a man named Ferguson overtook him on horseback and shot him. Coker threw up his arms and said something, but Nancy couldn't make out his words over the sound of the children screaming. Severely wounded, Elijah staggered to his feet under what must have been a rush of pure adrenaline. Shots continued to ring out as he ran toward a fence, some 50 yards from his home. With Ferguson and 9 other men in close pursuit, Elijah reached the fence. When he struggled to pull himself over it, Ferguson rode up close to him and shot him one more time. By the time Nancy reached the fence, their 11-year-old daughter, Sarah, had fought her way through the group of men to get to Elijah. She was kneeling next to his body, holding her daddy in her arms. She was covered in his blood. When Nancy reached Elijah, he gasped once, but never spoke. Nancy knelt beside her slain husband's body, the sounds of laughter emanating from the house, as Ferguson and his outlaw gang proceeded to ransack their home, taking the Coker's horse along with their valuables. This is the gruesome story of Champ Ferguson. The American Civil War is strangely named. It was far from civil by many accounts. The conflict is often presented as being fought with traditional armies, thousands of men dressed in blue and gray uniforms, charging across open fields, destroying each other while face to face in linear formations. While true, much of the war was also fought in the unconventional style of guerrilla warfare. To put it more precisely, a considerable amount of bloodshed that occurred during the conflict did not occur on the notorious battlefields. Americans, primarily those living in border states, were routinely being killed on their own properties, if not being murdered inside their very homes. While approximately 750,000 armed soldiers died between the Union and Confederacy, twice that number of total casualties, 1.5 million in all, including the wounded, have been reported. Unfortunately, with the passing of time, the number of civilian casualties has been far more difficult to calculate. Some sources have calculated civilian deaths at around 50,000. Nonetheless, considering the country's population was estimated at a mere 31.5 million at the time, the combined casualties of this war were significant. Many fighters among the guerrillas were sanctioned by neither the Union nor the Confederacy. They were considered lawless murderers. Unable to provide oversight for their crimes, and with these atrocities being committed by both Unionists and Confederate sympathizers, convictions for war crimes were scarce. Of the mere 2 individuals who were ultimately charged and executed for war crimes, One is a man considered the most notorious Confederate guerrilla fighter. While no amount of empirical digging can tell us more about this man than is recorded, the question remains: why would a mountain farmer, by all accounts a loving husband and father, torture, slaughter, and mutilate dozens of men, often in cold blood, men including his friends, members of his own family, unarmed boys, and helpless men as they lay in their beds? And once he was convicted, was he really executed? Or was there a conspiracy to save his life? Samuel Champ Ferguson grew up in the Cumberland Mountains of southern Kentucky, very near the border of northeastern Tennessee, the same region once inhabited by Davy Crockett. Before the Civil War, Ferguson was a farmer by trade for over 20 years. He liked to hunt, as hunting not only enabled him to get out into the mountains that he loved, but it was also a means of putting food on the table for his family. His long excursions gained him an intimate knowledge of the foothills and mountains, a knowledge that was to prove invaluable, enabling him to elude the Union guerrillas and Federal soldiers who hunted him relentlessly for the duration of the war. Whether inherited from his father or derived from some other dark recesses of his mind, Champ's venomous behavior was apparently well known, even before the war, beginning with a reported incident in 1858. Early that year, a man named Floyd Evans apparently failed to pay his debt in the agreed-upon time after purchasing livestock from Champ. In anger, Champ then tracked down and ambushed Floyd's twin brother, Alex Evans, stealing his horse as payment. A horse was not only expensive, it was often vital to a man's survival and livelihood. Horse theft was considered a serious crime. Floyd eventually paid his debt in June. Alex Evans, however, maintained his lawsuit against Champ for the theft of his horse. The Evans brothers began speaking out publicly, which Champ considered to be a threat on his life. A warrant for Ferguson's arrest was issued by the Fentress County Court. Champ apparently feigned ignorance of his arrest warrant and continued traveling in and out of Fentress County. However, after attending a religious camp meeting in August, as he was leaving, the Fentress County Constable attempted to administer the arrest warrant on Champ. A group of men joined him in the effort. Seeing the growing crowd of men, Champ attempted to escape, mounting his young horse. The men gave chase, throwing rocks. Champ's horse stumbled, and he had to escape on foot. Constable Reed was the first to reach him. Champ quickly pulled out his pocket knife and began slashing the constable, stabbing him to death. Champ then wounded Floyd Evans, nearly killing him, and escaped into a nearby farmhouse. Under threat of death by the mob, however, he surrendered himself to the Fentress County Sheriff to receive a fair trial. The local magistrate, James Zachary Sr., ordered his imprisonment. He was imprisoned for 2 months before his family secured his bail, using a large amount of their land as a collateral payment. Champ secured a useful attorney, Scott Bledsoe. In fact, although it was scheduled for the following January, Champ's trial for the killing of Jim Reed would never happen. It is unclear how he did it, but evidently Bledsoe managed to repeatedly delay Champ's trial date. Before a trial could be held, nearly 3 years had passed, and the South had seceded from the Union. It is speculated that Scott Bledsoe's influence, or Champ's indebtedness for his services, provoked Champ to support the Confederacy in the mounting conflict. At the onset of the war, as the oldest of the Ferguson children, Champ now found himself at menacing odds with his 9 brothers and sisters, his mother, and most of his friends and neighbors, all of whom supported the Union and deeply resented his taking up the Southern cause. While the following explanation of American political controversy may not necessarily be exciting, as with any other conflict, understanding the social and political attitudes of the time appears somewhat necessary in understanding some of the root causes of Champ's murderous behavior. In the 1850s, the debate over whether slavery should be extended into new Western territories sparked controversy between the two major political coalitions, the Whig Party and the Democrat Party. Southern Democrats promoted the expansion of slavery in all territories, while their northern counterparts thought each territory should decide for itself. The Republican Party was founded in 1854, merely 7 years before the onset of the Civil War, created by a combined group of anti-slavery Whigs, members of the Know-Nothing Party, and others. This new party garnered growing support around the nation, primarily in the North, having 2 of its presidential candidates elected to office immediately following its founding. Although wildly unpopular for his progressive views, Abraham Lincoln was the first to be elected, despite only receiving less than 40% of the popular vote. The debate over the future of slavery was a significant factor in rising tensions around the country. With the initial hope of avoiding violent conflict and preserving the Union, neither Lincoln nor many of his party members appear to have openly supported the idea of abolishing slavery, at least prior to the war. In some of his private correspondence, however, Lincoln acknowledged his disdain for the hypocrisy of living in a nation that abided by the immorality of slavery, as well as the controversial oppression of Irish immigrants and Catholics, when the nation had been founded on the belief that all men are created equal.
When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for example, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy.
Abraham Lincoln's letter to Joshua Speed, 1855. Again, the initial conflict around slavery was not necessarily the abolishment of slavery, but the debate over whether slavery would be permitted in the newly developing territories as American settlers moved west, as forced labor was considered an unfair advantage by those farmers who did not own slaves. Despite his actual statements, election propaganda touted Lincoln as a total abolitionist. Even despite his later efforts to mollify the Southern states by preserving their constitutional right to maintain the practice of slavery, his election greatly divided an already unsettled nation, triggering the secession of Southern states. As the war escalated, the Union Army was eager to consign any man willing to fight. Escaped and freed slaves were eager to fight, not only in defense of the Union, but for the freedom of their fellow slaves. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave himself, was perhaps the most recognized abolitionist of the time and served as an advisor to Lincoln. He reasoned with Lincoln on the fairness of these ideas of men willing to fight for their nation being granted equal rights in return for their service. Although there is more to the story than is covered here, Lincoln was swayed by Douglass's counsel. More than a year after the war began, in September of 1862, following the Union victory during the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, Lincoln presented the preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free those slaves residing in rebellious Southern states, should the Union win the war. As such political conflict is clearly never a simple matter, it is important to note that not every Republican supported the abolition of slavery, and at least a small handful of Democrat Party members later voted in favor of it. In Southern minds, however, the entire Republican Party, those associated with it, and their voters quickly became known as abolitionists, despite not all Republican partisans supporting the move to end slavery. In Champ Ferguson's rural mountain community, which had few slaves, partisan loyalties likewise appear to have been less about complex debates and simply about choosing the winning side. Thus, they destroyed each other merely for their loyalty to a preferred party, regardless of the political nuances. In addition, it is presumed that Champ's family also worried that the unsettled debt, the significant payment of land paid to secure his bail, would be lost if he fought for the South. Conversely, Champ may have been promised immunity by Scott Bledsoe, with his charges being dropped by a victorious Confederate government. In any case, during the war, Champ reportedly broke into the Fentress County Courthouse and cut the pages concerning his killing of Constable Reed out of the minutes book, thus destroying the record of his crime. Although no proof exists for his involvement, those few pages were indeed discovered to be missing. 1861. Following Tennessee's decision to secede from the Union in June of 1861, East Tennessee quickly became a target for unofficial engagements between Union and Confederacy partisans. As demonstrated by Champ, even before the war began, bloody conflict had occasionally occurred in the area, the lack of established law and order giving way to mob justice and the cultural practice of family feuds. The most common sources of strife were livestock, women, politics, and thievery. However, the onset of the Civil War arguably became the greatest single cause for such divided sentiments. Appalachian mountain culture dictated a more elemental code of loyalty. When a man took sides in the mountains, all ties were cut, and all on the other side became enemies. Family feuding was thus carried out under the guise of war, and by the spring of 1862, the Cumberland Mountains were rife with violence. Non-enlisted Confederate supporters brawled with the local Union supporters far from the front lines. The eventual movement of Union troops into Tennessee further escalated the tensions in the region. Undoubtedly, Champ's hatred for Lincoln, the federal government, and anyone who supported the Union was causal to his eventual brutality against those he encountered. With his entire community seemingly against him, why did Champ Ferguson ultimately side with the Confederacy? Unfortunately, the reasons reported for his ruthless loyalty are shrouded in contradiction. Ferguson reportedly provided the most feasible explanation for why he entered the war supporting the South, though it is less romantic than the others, which is that he was a Union man up until making his release bargain after killing Constable Reed.
When the war broke out,
he later said,
I was induced to join the Army on the promise that all prosecution in that case would be abandoned, and this is how I came to take up arms.
Considering he had not enlisted at that time, it is speculated that his loyalty to Scott Bledsoe and the potential promise Bledsoe made regarding Champ being offered immunity for his service to the Confederacy is what he was referring to by this statement. Despite fighting primarily as an unauthorized guerrilla, Champ repeatedly defended his violent actions as those of a legitimate Confederate soldier. However, he was not officially conscripted into the Confederate Army until 1864, 3 years after the war had started, and he had already killed dozens of men. As for his initial loyalties to the Confederacy, further interviews after the war would have Champ indicate that his allegiances solidified following the Confederate victory at the Virginia Battle of Bull Run in the early summer of 1861. This victory evidently indicated to him that he had chosen the winning side. By late 1861, however, Champ Ferguson had begun a war of personal vendetta, preemptively killing any civilians, whether friend or family, which he believed supported the Union. The following is a quote from reporter James Johnson, The Nashville Dispatch, 22nd of October, 1865. The wounded, the sick, the aged, and even helpless childhood were not spared from his brutal murders. He thought, he says, that he was engaged in legitimate warfare.
We were having a sort of miscellaneous war up there through Fentress County, Tennessee, and Clinton County, Kentucky, and all through that region. Every man was in danger of his life. If I hadn't have killed my neighbor, he would have killed me. Each of us had from 20 to 50 prescribed enemies, and it was regarded as legitimate to kill them at any time, at any place, under any circumstances, even if they were wounded or on a sick bed.
On December 2nd, Champ reportedly stole a horse at gunpoint from another local, nearly killing him for supposedly being a Lincoln supporter,
a damned Lincolnite.
Accompanied by 2 Confederate associates, he then rode the horse to the home of his old friend, Reuben Wood. A friend to the Ferguson family, Wood had known and cared for Champ since he was born. He had saved Champ's life, having intervened and preventing the mob from killing Champ after he stabbed the Fentress County constable to death. After the war began, Wood had found himself associated with the same Union company which Jim Ferguson, Champ's younger brother, had enlisted. Champ claimed the pair of them sought to kill him, if given the opportunity. He and his Confederate associates met Wood on the road in front of Wood's home as Wood returned from feeding his animals. Wood was unarmed. According to Wood's daughter, Elizabeth, Champ spoke briefly with Wood, casually exchanging their usual compliments. Ferguson then abruptly said,
"I suppose you've been to Camp Robinson."
It was not a question. Camp Robinson was a sore point for those who sided with the Confederacy, as they believed men were recruited there into the Home Guard, a group of local Union militia who defended the area. Wood truthfully acknowledged that he had. Ferguson asked what his business had been there, but before he could respond, according to Wood's daughter, Ferguson, using vile and bitter language, told him nobody but a damned old Lincolnite would be caught at any such place. After continuing this tirade for several minutes, Champ raised his pistol on Reuben.
"Don't you beg," Ferguson said, "and don't you dodge."
Wood's wife and daughter, now witnessing from the front of their home, begged Champ to spare his life. Reuben himself gave an impassioned plea, reminding Ferguson of their lifelong friendship, that he had nursed Champ as an infant.
"Reuben, you have always treated me like a gentleman,"
Ferguson responded.
"But you have been to Camp Robinson, and I intend to kill you."
Ferguson pulled the trigger, hitting Reuben in the chest. Reuben Wood proved difficult to kill, however. Even fatally wounded, he managed to escape into his home. With his wife and 2 children helpless to save him, Reuben suffered for 2 days before he finally succumbed to his fatal injury. A month later, after the nearby Battle of Mill Spring in mid-January, Ferguson went looking for another old friend, William Frogg. Esther Frogg sat peeling apples on her front porch as Champ Ferguson arrived in front of the home on horseback, again with 2 other Confederate men in accompaniment. Mrs. Frogg suspected no ill will. She had also known Champ since childhood. She kindly offered him a seat and an apple. Ferguson stepped onto the porch and, disregarding her invitation, walked purposefully into the home. William Frogg lay sick in his bed, their 5-month-old child in a crib nearby. Like many of his other victims, Frogg was unarmed. Unable to even raise himself from the bed, he weakly explained to his unexpected visitor that he had a relapse of the measles. Indeed, Union records show that he was on sick leave from his regiment, though he no doubt withheld that bit of information from Ferguson. Unfortunately, Ferguson already knew about his Union affiliation.
"I reckon you caught the measles at Camp Dick Robinson,"
Ferguson snarled as he raised his Colt revolver. Without another word, he squeezed the trigger twice as Frogg feebly attempted to pull the covers over his face. As was his routine after such murders, before leaving, Champ ransacked the cabin, looking for weapons and other valuables. With Champ's pro-Unionist family and community already against his Confederate support, the cold-blooded murders of Frogg and Wood, as well as his blatant theft of livestock and other crimes, roused the rest of the countryside against him. By this time, Champ's brother Jim had joined the Union's 1st Kentucky Cavalry as a scout, and the brothers had reportedly sworn to kill each other on sight, which no doubt would have happened had Jim not been ambushed and killed within a month of Reuben Wood's murder. After his father's murder, Reuben Wood's son, Robert, gathered a small band of armed men for the express purpose of killing Champ Ferguson. They missed their chance, as Champ quickly fled south across the border into secessionist Tennessee and joined a pro-Southern guerrilla band commanded by none other than his former attorney, Scott Bledsoe. Although Champ had since moved his family to Tennessee, he often returned to his home in Kentucky for his wartime exploits. Guerrilla fighting served as an alternative to military enlistment, permitting the participants to remain close to home in familiar territory throughout the war. The thought of justifiable violence and the lack of military custom appears to have attracted the more unhinged, bloodthirsty kind of men. Much of the brutal efficiency of the guerrilla was due to their lack of adherence to military custom, including their choice of weapons. The Colt pistol became a favorite among bushwhackers, as it offered a tactical advantage over rifles at close range. The clanking of sabers and carbine rifles against saddles could be heard over great distances at night. Stealth was one of the guerrillas' best tactics. Though more commonly sanctioned by Confederate authorities, guerrillas and anti-guerrilla bands existed on the Union side as well. As vicious in his defense of the Union as Champ was the Confederacy, a Fentress County man by the name of Dave Beatty would serve to become Champ's sworn enemy. Beatty was reportedly a nonpartisan civilian at the start of the war. Bledsoe's men later threatened Beatty's life if he refused to side with the Confederacy. Beatty responded to the threat in early 1862 by siding with the Union and raising his own band of guerrillas. His men lived in the woods, like Ferguson's, and practiced the same vicious tactics. Local legend tells of the time Beatty shot a man, and then directed his horse to step on the unfortunate victim's face. A local paper, the Nashville Dispatch, noted that Beatty fought Champ Ferguson from the beginning to the end of his career. They have shot at each other innumerable times, and each has received ugly wounds. They were deadly enemies and hunted each other down with savage ferocity. Beatty even testified against Champ during his post-war trial in 1865. Regardless of their loyalties, both Union and Confederate enlisted soldiers disparaged and shamed these partisan rangers, calling them bushwhackers, freebooters, or other dishonorable terms like carpet knights and featherbed soldiers, due to their apparent unwillingness to depart from the comfort of their homes and a warm bed. This, however, was not strictly true to form, as both prudent fighters and civilians left their homes during this period, lest they become an easy-to-find target. Champ Ferguson would indicate the legitimacy of this concern, as he seemed to delight in catching his enemies off guard, slaughtering many of his victims in their beds or just outside their homes. 1862. Throughout the 4 years of war, Ferguson went on to kill regular soldiers, members of the Home Guard, and simple farmers. He murdered helpless prisoners and the children of his perceived enemies. Although at times he used his pistol or rifle, he reportedly preferred to do his killing up close and personal with a Bowie knife. Further to these were rumors of decapitations and corpse desecration, such as the placing of severed heads or rolling them down hills for entertainment. Champ later attributed his use of a knife as his calling card to distinguish his kills. He purportedly put a notch in his knife handle after every kill, at least until he had to end this practice, since the handle had no space left to add more notches. In the early spring of 1862, towards the end of March, according to Union fighter Elijah Coger's third great-grandson, a meeting was held at Monroe, Tennessee, between a group of citizens from Overton County, Tennessee, representing the southern element of the war, and a group of citizens from Fentress County, Tennessee, and Clinton County, Kentucky, representing the northern element. Elijah had headed up a group of Home Guardsmen who kept watch over Clinton County. One of their jobs was to keep up with the whereabouts of Ferguson. Elijah's role in the Home Guardsmen would explain why he was one of the men chosen to work out the peace agreement at Monroe. The purpose of the meeting had been to reach a compromise whereby raiders would stop wreaking havoc in those 3 counties. The meeting was a success. The parties agreed not to conduct raids into any of the adjoining counties, but it would soon be evident that not everyone who attended the meeting wanted peace. Because he was one of the men responsible for most of the raids and most of the deaths, Ferguson was also at this meeting. What Elijah and the other Union representatives who attended the meeting at Monroe did not know was that Ferguson hated the Union side so much that just their presence at the peace agreement was enough for Champ to want to kill them. They would soon pay for trying to bring peace to the community. On April 1st, Champ and others among Bledsoe's men reportedly murdered 5 men in a single day in Fentress County. Among them were several men who had been counted among the Union representatives at the Monroe Peace meeting: Joseph Stover, William Johnson, Robert Martin, and Lewis Pierce. By Champ's account, Stover was killed in a gunfight. Both Martin and Pierce were presumably unarmed and shot while running away, with Pierce being brought down with a double-barrel shotgun. Court documents indicate all three of their bodies were found both shot and stabbed through the heart. Johnson was a Union soldier home on leave at the time, staying with his father. He was chased over a bluff by Bledsoe's men, falling about 40 or 50 feet before being shot. Although he contested the circumstances of their deaths, Champ readily admitted to these killings, claiming that these men were Union home guards who sought to kill him. His last victim that day, however, was not a man per se, but a local youth named Fount Zachary. Near Spring Creek, Kentucky, he encountered the 16-year-old Zachary. Whether by misprint or journalistic sensationalism, the Nashville Dispatch later reported Fount to be as young as 12. Fount was the grandson of James Zachary Sr., the magistrate who had imprisoned Champ for killing Constable Jim Reed prior to the war. As with many of his other victims, Champ seized on the opportunity for revenge. It was a Sunday morning. No. Okay, just need to go give my voice a rest. Yeah, it's like my voice. It's so annoying though that I can't. I gotta read through like friggin' 4 pages of text before my voice is like, oh, okay, yeah, I want to work for you now. Garbage. Okay. I really hate that. The combined casualties of this war were significant. I think I'm done. Yeah, I like to read when I did it. There's no reason, just because my voice kind of dropped a little bit, to have to go back and do this again. Wasting my time. Impress you all with my magical guitar skills. Terrible, isn't it?